I'm going to, with apologies, I guess talk and run because I do have to move over to the airport to leave. I want to just take this opportunity, since I do have the microphone, to thank again our hosts, Sebastian and Novum Institute, as well as ELF. It's been a very nice and I think thought-provoking and just genial occasion to see all of you and to listen to what I think is some important political, and I would also add intellectual conversations on this important topic. Sebastian asked me to offer maybe a few thoughts on think tanks as we see them in the United States. And I don't, I'm here under false pretenses. My work obviously focuses on Central and Eastern Europe, so I can't call myself an expert on American think tanks. I happen to live in Washington, D.C., so I suppose by that account I can claim to know something about them. I'll just offer a few more, mostly impressionistic considerations of the U.S. Think tank community, and I use that phrase in reference to what Frederick von Mill, I think, interestingly was discussing yesterday about having these perfect words in Dutch and German, and I forget the actual word, to connote some measure of coming together and not quite finding the right word in English. And afterwards I spoke to him and I said, well, politicians use the word community in the United States to talk about these groups, but they have to use an adjective to describe them. And so you would say the policy community in the United States, the environmental community, the Hispanic community, and it's a way to politically sound like you're involving everyone, albeit everyone in that particular frame of mind. So I'll just offer that sort of side note. When my president, NDI's president Ken Wallach, meets with ambassadors and other people arriving in Washington who often come by and say, hey, I'm here, wanted to meet you. I'm also interested to know your take on Washington, how it works. Ken makes a really interesting point that I had never thought about, but I think it's true, and that is the power in Washington, maybe as compared to European capitals, is very diffused. It is obviously about the White House, it is about the administration, that's the first port of call, but even that is a very diffused concept because you have to go to the National Security Council, the National Security Administration, you have to go over to the Pentagon, now you have to go to Homeland Security if you want to talk about defense or national security issues. And if you walk down the line of policy areas, both with respect to foreign policy, which ambassadors often are focused on, but also domestic policy issues, boy, there's just a huge amount of places to go, people to meet, and venues to be at. And I say that because think tanks in Washington, are really part of that power structure. They are places to go to. They are part of that diffused network of, let's say, political power, or the place where politics and policy intersect. And obviously among them there's some very important powerhouses, some of which have been mentioned in yesterday, the Brookings Institute, Heritage Foundation, the Cato Institute, the Rand Corporation, and here of course I'm limiting myself actually just to the Washington policy community or think tank community. But if you were to go to the state level, to Sacramento, to Columbus, to St. Paul, to Austin, to Denver, you would see as well think tanks operating at the state level. They're dealing with immigration issues at their states, they're dealing with tax issues, transport, very policy focused. When you go back up to Washington, well, you encounter almost a hybrid, almost a think tank on steroids, as we would say, organization institutes that are fundamentally about public policy, but which carry, I think, a very strong political dimension for several reasons. One is the first that I just mentioned, and that is that power diffusion. that they are part of the, understood anyway, to be part of the political power structures in Washington. And I'll pause on that for a second. You know, we don't have, unlike the Westminster systems, shadow cabinets. We don't have the opposition structured in a way to be the government out of power. And partly, it didn't occur to me before, but it seems to me that that's because a lot of people who were formerly in government in high-level positions, both political and policy, basically the political leadership in the various departments, will cycle out when a new administration comes in, whether it's, you know, in the case, whether it's the same party or not, will cycle out and go to think tanks and take up residence, as we say, in think tanks. A lot of them also go to K Street and make millions of dollars in lobbying. That's a different story. But a lot of them go to think tanks and then house themselves, if you will, and are very much involved in public policy discussions. They are obviously freer. They are obviously more independent, quote unquote, but they're there in residence essentially to keep involved in public policy, not in a formal way, and then when the opportunity presents itself, to go back into government, probably at a higher level, and again take up residence now as a government official. So in a way that almost becomes kind of a very, again, diffused type of shadow cabinet, not explicitly in opposition. So that's one way in which you have this hybrid of policy and politics. Yesterday's discussion about the Slovenian legislation on political foundations was fascinating to me, because there is absolutely no way you could possibly ever think about public financing in any way, shape, or matter or form about political foundations in the United States. It is just cannot be part of the conversation. Certainly for the center-right think tanks, how could they possibly take U.S. government money to support their endeavors? It's an out-and-out political falsehood. But so I found the discussion yesterday very interesting, only for that basis, and it does show how different we are in our political understandings to begin with at the very outset. And there's a lot that I see on the European side that I think is very good, in the sense that we, for our free enterprise, free market, free individual, ultimately very liberal structures, don't necessarily have much in the way of a common understanding about the role of think tanks. And that's, again, why you see such a wide array. Having said that, you know, there are some think tanks that do obviously take U.S. government grants, the RAND Corporation being one of them, being a respected think tank with hundreds of PhDs and anything from missile systems and neuroscience to, you know, Syria affairs, taking research grants and really offering some very down the line, straightforward, neutral policy prescriptions, sometimes, you know, not necessarily for the public domain. So you have that type of think tank. Then you come to the more, let's say, political think tanks in the Heritage Foundation and Cato and Brookings and the Center for American Process, and that's really where you do get more of a political veneer. I took a moment to take a look at their websites, kind of their front pages, and read their mission statements, and I think you'll get a sense of what I mean. Let's see, it's Heritage. Yeah, sorry, it's on this piece of paper. The Heritage Foundation was founded in 1973 as a research and educational institution, a think tank, whose mission is to formulate and promote conservative public policies based on the principles of free enterprise, limited government, individual freedom, traditional American values, and a strong national defense. That's classic. That is classic values-based policy focus, and one would ascribe that to a think tank, a policy think tank with a particular political, let's say, orientation. And then they go on to say our vision is to build an America where freedom, opportunity, prosperity, and civil society flourish. You could go to a Republican campaign and you could see the very same language. So there's an aspirational element to what the Heritage Foundation offers as a think tank that I think is very consistent with what you would understand a political vision to be. And again, it kind of goes to that double-edged nature of how they are both that hybrid of policy, yeah, that's true, and with an overt political direction that they wish to take. And similarly, the Center for American Progress, which was founded in the wake of the Clinton administration by senior Clinton officials, being more, let's say, center-left, they have a longer mission statement. They have more to say somehow. But they talk about being an independent, nonpartisan educational institute, same language as Heritage, dedicating to improving the lives of Americans through progressive ideas and action. Not just ideas, but action. Building on the achievements of progressive pioneers such as Teddy Roosevelt and Martin Luther King, yet another form of political identity. Our work addresses 21st century challenges such as energy, national security, economic growth, immigration, education, and healthcare. Even there, you'll sense a difference. That's policy. Those are all policy areas, but what they choose to emphasize is a little different from what you'll hear from Heritage, which is another comment I want to make in a minute. So if they're talking about immigration and healthcare, CAP, Center for American Enterprise, Heritage over here is talking about strong national defense. So you get a sense of how that interplay works, how that contrast is drawn. And then they go on, similar to Heritage, and offer a broad political type of message. As progressives, we believe America is allowed a boundless opportunity where people can better themselves, their children, their families, their communities, through education, hard work, and the freedom to climb the ladder of economic mobility. That to me sounds like a very European liberal statement in certain ways, which again, just on that point, I don't necessarily myself see a direct correlation between U.S. Democrats on the one hand and social democrats in Europe. I would probably actually see U.S. Democrats being more European liberal with some elements of social democracy built in. We believe an open and effective government can champion the common good. Okay, that's more social democratic. Over narrow self-interest, now we're straying a little bit from the liberal notion, harness the strength of our diversity and secure the rights and safety of our people. They're trying to sound social democratic, liberal in the American sense, and conservative at the same time. But that's a statement, again, like Heritage, that you might ascribe to a political campaign, right? So they're not just saying we are here to develop policy, we are here as well to promote a certain political vision. So that's why I say they're a hybrid. They have they've got the PhDs. If you go on these websites, you will see 40 people either in residence or on paid fellowships or developing white papers or new books, and they are all very, very accomplished academics, people coming from government, people coming from civil society, journalists. This is a power-packed series of institutions and groups, but it's not just about public policy. And if you turn on the television and you watch the news shows, you will see people from the think tanks out promulgating their ideas. That's great, and advocating, and that's probably a good thing too. But again, it's just being a think tank. It is espousing, embracing, and being a part of the political machine that is Washington. Going back to what's emphasized and what's not, if you continue on in the websites of the Heritage Foundation and the Center for American Process, you'll see things that are, So Heritage, the things that leap out at you, among other things, granted, and even the titling of this is interesting. It's more of a blog type of let's say, information. It's not by any means a scholarly research paper, but this is their front door. This is what you see when you walk in their house. Heritage, help, the government took my property. as being one of the blog spots that they're going to emphasize. Iran's leader in sheep's clothing. Don't believe Rouhani for a minute. We have to back Israel. And a feature on red tape, bureaucratic red tape in the Obama administration. And another one on the 2013 Index of Economic Freedom. So here you have a series of things that can both be ascribed as policy. We need to look at examine government bureaucracy and try to, minimize it. And by the way, we want to take a look at statistical data on an economic freedom index. And actually, those things are kind of liberal in many respects, I would think. But it's a leading type of agenda, and that's what they're focusing on. And when you, again, walk back over to the Center for American Progress, you will see things like, have they no shame? Republicans who slash essential programs for those in need, one about the unmet needs of gay and lesbian youth who are homeless, or the state of women in the world. And what I'm trying to say here is that it's what they choose to promote and what they choose to ignore are very much a part of their identity. Not every think tank, of course, is going to take up every topic, but the decision as to what to explore, the decision as to what to leave out as a think tank is itself a fairly political one at that. And that means that you will be branded, you brand yourself, I think, conscientiously, consciously you're seeking to brand yourself, again, because you are part of that Washington power structure. Right? So it's a large community, it's a diversified community, it's a political community, it's a policy community, and it's a powerful one at that. And that's how I would describe the Washington think tanks. When I look at Central and Eastern Europe, obviously I'm not going to draw any comparisons, that's kind of ridiculous. But what I do find a little frustrating is that when you go to places like in Southeastern Europe, when you go to places like Bosnia-Herzegovina, when you go to places like Macedonia, where, by the way, I think our colleague from Macedonia is doing very normal work, but normal work that is, because of the political environment there, becoming increasingly courageous work at that, even though it's very normal work and shouldn't be described as anything but. But the problem is I see that there's no policy because there's no politics. There's, in a way, no politics going on in these countries because the political elite stymie that type of discussion. And then by consequence, civil society groups, including think tanks, are stymied from entering into a discussion that could be had. In Bosnia, I've had conversations with groups that are think tanks, that they want to talk about open government, for example. They're a little bit more process-oriented, and in emerging democratic systems, I think that's perfectly fine. And at home, we have that in groups like Common Cause, which are process think tanks. They're trying to look at the governmental process, the political process, and reform it, which is another dimension we haven't talked about. We've been talking about public policy, but governance and political process is also an important element of think tank work. But in Bosnia, having these conversations, and it's very constraining because people in the civil society community will say, well, I want to engage, but if I reach out to a political party, I myself will be branded as political. I can't do that. It will compromise myself. And otherwise, you're left with this notion that unless you're a political party official, unless you're a politician, you can't play. You can't say anything. You have to be in the party structure in order to be a part of this discussion, limited as it is. And I find that frustrating because maybe going back to the American side of things, you don't need a permission slip. You have an essential role to play in civil society because you are going to be more neutral, because people need to hear that third view, not just government, not just opposition. And so we're trying to work with some groups in Sarajevo to promote their role vis-a-vis and with political parties, plural, in discussions around public policy. In Macedonia, it's also frustrating, I'm sure, because there's so many issues, not least Skopje 2014, which is a huge remake of Central Skopje that is very much about public policy. It is certainly about fiscal policy, and there has been absolutely no discussion about it whatsoever. And with the amount of money involved or thought to be involved, because we don't have a clear disclosure of what's been paid for all of these architectural wonders that are now defining Skopje's central core, it's frustrating. And one element that we have thought of at NDI is to try to use Parliament as a venue for some type of public discussion through a public hearing process, which is actually quite adversarial, or can be, but even just trying to get some MPs whose job it is, after all, to pass legislation and to formally review the performance of government, to engage with civic groups. Parliament's not the only venue, but I think it's an essential one. And at least there you have the opportunity for a highly structured and therefore maybe more constructive type of conversation. But it is certainly, let's say, a work in progress. Just one other example, Bosnia saw a very troubling incident this summer when a young girl who had a fatal illness could not leave the country to get the operation she needed, and she died. And that's because the government agency could not issue her a passport to travel, and that is because, and this is where I get a little confused, there was a disagreement between the parties along ethnic lines as to how to make some nomenclature decisions that would allow for the issuance of passports. People went out to the streets and they demonstrated and said, this is really, truly horrendous. I mean, it's been bad, but this now, when we see a 6-month-old girl die because of your inability to agree, is truly, truly now preposterous. That's an expression of outrage. There is a clear need for a public policy dialogue on passport issuance and other things. And that second element is not there. Okay, so when that happens, there's not an ability to take that into Parliament, for example, and have a committee hearing on the actual ramifications of this public policy obstacle. Or we were talking with gay rights groups in Belgrade on Monday about the cancellation for the second year at least of the Pride Parade in Belgrade. And that was it. So the government makes its decision, people are outraged, they make public statements, and yet that's about it. So there's no discussion per se in Belgrade about how actually are we making these decisions? How actually do we evaluate the security process for a parade of this nature in which, the government society has a competing interest to uphold people's right to assembly? And can you not have a policy-based discussion on this type of thing that would at least help people understand and maybe make improvements to the decision-making process? And the government can come in and say, look, we have the responsibility for security in the capital, so we're not necessarily going to go out and involve everyone in this consultation and make this joint decision. We will retain the authority to make the decision, but at least they have the chance to go publicly to say that. And again, we're blocked because those types of conversations where you have these political showdowns are not followed through with a public policy discussion, that dimension, which again can be constructive, can solve some problems, and involve think tanks, and involve civil society groups who have something to say about these public policy arenas. That's the turn that we'd like to promote in the region. And I keep going back to Parliament because I do think that there's a legislative dimension to all of this, of course, and that you are linking, we're linking politics with public policy, but you also then have to take public policy and link it to legislation and the formal lawmaking, budget-making process, of course. I think I will stop there. I obviously started in America, but I kind of went to what I know or observe anyway through our programs in the region. And thanks for the attention.